On the morning of August 17, 1942, at exactly 0917 hours, Sergeant Clyde Thomasson crouched behind a palm tree on Makin Island with sweat running down his spine and salt spray clinging to his uniform. In his hands was a Winchester Model 1897 shotgun, a weapon many of his own officers had dismissed as obsolete, something better suited for farmers and hunters than for modern warfare. At 27 years old, Thomasson was leading 12 Marines against an estimated 70 Japanese defenders who had transformed every trench, hut, and concrete position on the island into carefully prepared killing zones. Machine gun fire stitched the sand barely 20 yards to his left, the sharp crack of bullets cutting through the humid air. His shotgun held 5 shells of double-aught buckshot, 45 steel pellets capable of turning confined spaces into instant slaughter. Yet despite its power, Thomasson had never fired the weapon in combat. Only 6 months earlier, Marine weapons instructors had laughed at the old pump-action shotgun, calling it a relic from another era. Compared to the semi-automatic M1 Garand, which held 8 rounds and could strike targets hundreds of yards away, the shotgun seemed primitive, limited, and crude. When Thomasson had asked to carry it into battle, his company commander had ordered him to leave the antique behind and carry a real rifle. What stayed Thomasson's hand that morning was not Marine Corps doctrine, but memory. His father had told him stories of the Western Front in 1918, of muddy trenches and German officers who filed diplomatic protests against American shotguns, calling them weapons of terror. German commanders had even threatened to execute any captured American soldier found carrying one. That alone told Thomasson something important. As Japanese rifle fire poured from a concrete pillbox ahead of him, he realized he was about to learn exactly why the Kaiser's army had feared this weapon so deeply. The Winchester Model 1897 possessed one feature that changed everything. It had no trigger disconnector. If the shooter held the trigger down and worked the pump, the gun fired every time the bolt slammed forward. 5 shells in 2 seconds inside a trench or bunker. It was like detonating a grenade with precision and control. When Thomasson kicked in the door of a Japanese sniper hut and pulled the trigger, he became the first Marine to prove that the Pacific War was about to hear a new sound, one that would soon be associated with sudden, overwhelming violence. The hard metallic clack of an American shotgun slide. The real question was never whether the shotgun could kill. The question was whether Marines would trust their lives to a weapon their own army had written off. The Winchester Model 1897 had been killing efficiently for nearly half a century before it ever reached the Pacific. Designed by John Moses Browning in 1896, it was intended as a hunting shotgun for civilians. It featured an external hammer, a tubular magazine beneath the barrel, and a pump action that could cycle faster than most shooters could aim. By the outbreak of World War I, hundreds of thousands were already in civilian hands across the United States. When American troops arrived in France in 1917, they brought shortened trench versions of the Model 1897 fitted with bayonet lugs and heat shields. Loaded with double-aught buckshot, these weapons were devastating in the narrow confines of trenches where German soldiers advanced shoulder to shoulder. One American with a slam-fire shotgun could stop an entire assault in seconds. German outrage followed swiftly. Official protests accused the United States of violating the laws of war. The irony was thick, coming from an army that had introduced poison gas and flamethrowers. The U.S. ignored the protests and continued issuing shotguns. By the time the armistice ended the war in 1918, trench shotguns had earned a brutal reputation. But when the war ended, they were packed away. Military planners assumed the next conflict would be fought at long range with rifles, artillery, and aircraft. Shotguns were labeled specialized weapons, suitable only for guard duty. That assumption collapsed on December 7, 1941. The Pacific War forced American forces into terrain where visibility was measured in yards, not miles. Dense jungle, coral ridges, and cave systems turned combat into close-range chaos. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, commander of the newly formed 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, understood this better than most. Having studied guerrilla warfare with Chinese Communist forces, Carlson wanted weapons suited for sudden, violent encounters at arm's length. Alongside Thompsons and bars, he requested shotguns. The Marine Corps had several hundred Model 1897s and newer Model 12s in storage, both capable of slam fire. On paper, the shotgun became the fastest-firing shoulder weapon at close range in the American arsenal. In practice, skepticism remained. Shotgun ammunition was heavy, limited in range, and vulnerable to humidity. Many officers saw the weapon as a liability. Sergeant Clyde Thomasson saw it differently. Raised hunting in rural Georgia, he trusted shotguns in thick cover. At Camp Pendleton, he practiced relentlessly, learning to fire all 6 shells in under 3 seconds while keeping the muzzle on target. When the 2nd Raider Battalion boarded submarines bound for Makin Island in August 1942, Thomasson sat at the bow with his shotgun ready. Intelligence had underestimated the Japanese garrison, and when the raiders hit the beach, chaos erupted. Boats overturned, men drowned under heavy loads, and Japanese fire came from prepared positions. Thomasson reached shore with his weapon dry. Ahead of him were defenders ready to die. Behind him were scattered Marines fighting to regroup. The next hours would test whether the trench gun's reputation was deserved. 4 days later, on Guadalcanal, another lesson was about to be written in blood. Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki led 900 elite Japanese infantry against the Marine perimeter along the Ilu River. Confident in bayonet charges and fighting spirit, Ichiki believed the Americans would collapse. Instead, his men walked into a killing zone of 37mm guns loaded with canister, machine guns firing non-stop, and Marines in foxholes armed with rifles, bars, and a growing number of shotguns. When Japanese soldiers slipped through the lines, they encountered Marines like Private Johnny Rivers, who emptied his Model 12 in seconds, buckshot shredding the jungle at close range. By dawn, over 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Marine losses were minimal. Ichiki burned his colors and killed himself. The age of mass bayonet charges was over. As the Pacific War progressed, shotguns followed Marines into the bloodiest battles. At Tarawa, Marines faced concrete bunkers that survived naval bombardment. Clearing them required men willing to crawl close enough to fire buckshot through narrow firing slits. Officers like Major Henry Jim Crow carried shotguns themselves, leading from the front. Shotguns proved invaluable in clearing trenches and bunkers at ranges where rifles were too slow and too precise. Tarawa was a slaughter, but it taught hard lessons. American planners adjusted tactics, equipment, and weapon allocations. Shotguns became standard for assault units. Nowhere was this more evident than Okinawa. There, Japanese forces built defenses deep into limestone ridges, forcing Americans into brutal cave fighting. Over 800 shotguns were carried into the campaign. Marines learned that buckshot filled confined spaces in ways rifle bullets could not. Staff Sergeant William Manchester led his men into dark tunnels where every corner could hide death. In one encounter, he fired 3 shells in under 2 seconds, 54 pellets ending the fight instantly. Flamethrowers suppressed positions, but shotguns finished them. The cost was staggering. Okinawa became the deadliest battle of the Pacific War. Over 12,000 Americans died. Japanese losses exceeded 100,000. Yet the campaign proved that American forces had mastered close-quarters warfare. Shotguns were not miracle weapons, but they were indispensable tools when combined with flamethrowers, demolitions, and disciplined infantry tactics. By 1945, more than 80,000 shotguns had been issued in the Pacific. They were no longer curiosities, but recognized components of American doctrine. Japanese records captured after the war rarely singled out shotguns as uniquely terrifying, focusing instead on flamethrowers and explosives. But casualty statistics told a clear story. Units equipped with shotguns suffered fewer losses during bunker-clearing operations. Veterans consistently reported greater confidence when carrying them. The war ended before the planned invasion of Japan, but American forces were already preparing thousands more shotguns for urban combat. The weapon that had once been dismissed as a relic had proven its value in the most intimate, violent form of warfare imaginable. From the palm trees of Makin to the caves of Okinawa, the shotgun earned its place not through legend, but through necessity. It reminded an industrial-age military of an old truth. When fighting collapses into darkness and distance disappears, simple, brutal tools endure.